Thank you. Is that okay for sound? Great. Okay, well, thank you very much, and apologies for having to transition to English, but it is absolutely the only way for me. And thank you for having me. It's a great chance for Oxfam to come and talk about our new campaign on inequality and to see how much complementarity and similarity there is between our messages on inequality and the work that Kepa is doing and all of you here. So it's really great to be here. I wanted to start with a very short video, which is going to summarize some of the messages from our report, and then I'll go through and talk through some of the key messages from our campaign and hopefully have some time for some questions, because unfortunately I will be unable to participate in the debate, not for not wanting to. So yeah, if we could start with the video. Thank you.
Around the world, we've made extraordinary progress in the fight against poverty. Together, we've successfully reduced child mortality and world hunger while increasing the availability of healthcare and education. However, this progress on tackling extreme poverty is now under threat. It's being undermined by extreme inequality. In 2014, just 85 people have as much wealth as the poorest half of humanity, and it's getting worse. 7 out of 10 people now live in countries where the gap between rich and poor is bigger than 3 decades ago. While this is affecting all of us, those living in poverty are suffering the most, as the concentration of wealth and resources leaves them behind. In Zambia alone, despite strong economic growth over the past 7 years, the number of people living below the poverty line grew to 74%. So how is this happening? Let's for a moment imagine that you're very rich and wealthy. Your wealth gives you power and influence to pressure governments into creating rules and policies that favour you. For example, by letting you pay less tax, or make laws that allow you to pay your workers less money than they need to live a decent life. As these rules are rigged in your favour, you get richer and have more influence and more power. A vicious circle is formed. Now, let's assume you're not one of the super rich. Like most of us, you're living in a system that isn't designed for you, paying your fair share of taxes but not getting an equal voice to influence decisions. Decent healthcare and education may be out of your reach because the government doesn't have the taxes to fund it, and low wages make it difficult to provide for you and your family. If you're a woman, you'll find this even more difficult because of other elements of inequality working against you. Inequality is not accidental or inevitable. It's the result of deliberate policy choices by the people in power. But we can change this. With your help, we can get governments to reverse these policies. We can push for fairer tax systems and the closure of tax loopholes, so the richest companies and individuals all pay their fair share, like you do. We can call for governments to use that money to make sure free public health and education are available for everyone. This isn't an unrealistic goal. Just 1.5% of the combined wealth of all the world's billionaires could fill the annual shortfall in funds needed to provide health services in the world's poorest countries, and pay for every child in the world to go to school. We need your help to highlight these issues and hold those that are cheating the system and society to account. Join us and the millions of others who are committed to reducing the gap between the rich and the rest. Together, we'll even it up.
Okay, so thank you. So I think it's important to start by talking about why are we talking about inequality, especially for those in the room who work in NGOs that focus on international development or development cooperation. For many years now, we've focused much more on extreme poverty. So are we talking about a switch here? Is this something different and something new? Well, first of all, I would argue that it's not something different and something new, but an essential element of addressing extreme poverty. And why we need to talk about inequality now is, of course, because the rapid rise of extreme economic inequality is significantly hindering our fight against poverty. So the two are closely related. Now, Oxfam did some research in Kenya, Indonesia, and India, and we found that millions more people could be lifted out of poverty if income inequality were reduced. And if we just look at the figures from India, you can see the scale of this. So if India stopped inequality from rising, not even thinking of a reverse at this point, but simply stopped inequality from rising, it could end extreme poverty for 90 million people by 2019. If it actually went further and reduced inequality, by 36% in this case, it could virtually eliminate extreme poverty. And we have similar numbers from Kenya and Indonesia. It's not just Oxfam that thinks this, so other research from the Brookings Institution found at a global level that if inequality were reduced, 463 million more people would be lifted out of poverty compared to a scenario where inequality increases. And finally, another example is that by reducing the income share of the richest 20% by just 1%, it could save the lives of 90,000 infants each year. So this is just to make the point that the policies that both reduce poverty and reduce inequality are complementary and mutually reinforcing. So it's not a question of whether we're talking about inequality or poverty reduction, but rather that we need to tackle inequality for poverty reduction. And I think that's important when we're talking to colleagues in the international development sphere. So the question of why now, so inequality is obviously not a new phenomenon, but within country inequality, and that's both income and wealth, has been growing at a staggering rate. And this is a graph showing English-speaking countries, the UK, US, Canada, and Australia, just as an example. And this is showing from 1910 to 2010, so a 100-year span. We see a long period of a decline in inequality up until the 1980s, 1990s, when there's been a steep rise, bringing us to where we are now. So I think this picture shows us why this is such an important issue. So as was mentioned, 2 weeks ago, Oxfam launched its new Even It Up campaign, and this is a global campaign. It's a long-term campaign aiming to run for at least 5 years, 5 to 10 years, where we're aiming to shift the terms of the debate around inequality. So not just seeking one or two specific policy changes, but rather shifting the entire way we think about inequality and really ensuring that people understand the problem of inequality is not accidental, it's not inevitable, and that active citizens mobilizing together can change these trends. So I think some of the shocking figures in the report we released, we've talked a lot about the 85 wealthiest people, and in the report we show that in the last year, the world's 85 wealthiest people have gained $500,000 every minute. And I think that helps to make the point for why now. I think also it really also shows that there's something very wrong in a system where there's been this much wealth accumulated by such a small number of people, while at the same time millions of people lack very basic goods and services they need to survive. So it's not just Oxfam that's worried about these issues, obviously, nor the organizations here, but organizations and individuals from across the political spectrum are concerned. So we've seen Kofi Annan talking about the role that extreme inequality is playing in slowing the pace of poverty reduction. And we've seen even organizations like the IMF, so Christine Lagarde, talking about how the benefits of growth are being enjoyed by far too few people. And that this is a recipe not for stability or sustainability. So this isn't necessarily an issue about left or right. I think people across the political spectrum are recognizing that inequality is bad for all of us. So why is inequality bad for all of us? I think inherently many people, especially if you work in development or in the NGO space, probably inherently feel that inequality is unfair. But it's bad for other reasons as well. So first of all, we know that economic inequality, it's associated with a range of health and social problems, including mental illness and violent crime. For example, homicide rates are almost 4 times higher in countries with extreme economic inequality. And also looking at Latin America, which is the world's most unequal and insecure region, it has 41 of the world's 50 most dangerous cities. So I think it's really important to make that point that inequality is bad for both rich and poor. The next question is to look at what has caused the inequality explosion. And this is a really important point that I hope came through in the video as well. The problem of inequality is not accidental and it's not inevitable. It's the result of deliberate political choices, and we all have the power to change those. So from Oxfam's perspective, there's two real drivers behind the reason why inequality is so bad, why we saw that picture of inequality declining, but this increase. Two real driving forces behind that. The first is market fundamentalism, and the second is capture of power by elites. So first, looking at market fundamentalism, what do we mean by this? And we have a quote from the economist Joseph Stiglitz. So market fundamentalism is a term that Stiglitz and other economists use to describe a dominant economic idea that sustained economic growth can only come from reducing government intervention, privatizing public services, and leaving markets to their own devices. And this really has been the dominant economic ideology for the last 20 or 30 years. But as Thomas Piketty recently demonstrated in his book, without government intervention, the market economy tends to concentrate wealth in the hands of very few. And that's what we've seen, and why we've seen inequality rising in recent decades. So the second real driver behind the problem of inequality that we think as Oxfam is the capture of power and politics by elites. And that's something that we believe is bad for all of us. So I think everybody can probably imagine this problem is worse in some countries than others, but the influence and interests of economic and political elites can reinforce inequality. And that's because money buys political clout. So the richest and most powerful can use that to further entrench their advantages. And what are some of these advantages? So for example, influencing government decisions, taking advantage of tax exemptions, contracts, land concessions, subsidies, and pressuring administrations to block policies that may strengthen the power of workers or smallholder farmers, or to block policies that would lead to increased taxation and making taxation more progressive. So just looking at this chart at the bottom is from a study that Oxfam did in a number of countries that you may not be able to read the list there from the back. So it's Spain, Brazil, India, the US, the UK, South Africa, and the Netherlands. And people in these countries were asked the question, the rich have too much influence over where this country is headed. They were asked to say whether they agreed with that statement. And as you can see from the green, which is people that either strongly agree or agree with that statement, the vast majority of people are concerned that the rich have too much influence over the direction their country is headed. So this is a widespread problem and one that people inherently understand. Right. So, of course, the next question is what can be done? We say that it's not inevitable or accidental that inequality has been growing, so what can be done? The first thing I want to talk about is very briefly in terms of international cooperation. And that is, we can see all countries, including Finland, working together through international agreements to address inequality. So one way that we can do that is this year, next year, coming up post-2015, the process through which we're going to replace the Millennium Development Goals, where countries will be negotiating and agreeing about what's important. We can ensure that there is a standalone goal on inequality in any post-2015 agreement, so that all countries are committing to take action against inequality. And Oxfam has proposed a goal that looks like this, where we say that all countries should commit to reduce income inequality so that the post-tax income of the top 10%, the richest 10% of people, is no more than the post-transfer income of the bottom 40%. That's just one way that we could measure inequality in a future post-2015 development framework. But of course, going beyond what countries can do on the international stage, really the majority of action needed to address inequality is going to be at the national level. So we're now going to look at several policy areas that we think need action in order to close the gaps between rich and poor. So the first one is around work and wages and the idea of working our way to a more equal world. And I think anybody is probably aware that right now we have millions of people working for indecently low wages, whilst others are benefiting from scandalously high rewards, for example, for top business executives. And that level of inequality, I think, is very obvious in our world today. For most people, their economic status is generated by the income they earn. And for the world's poorest people, doesn't matter how hard they work, for the wages that they have, they cannot escape poverty, while we're seeing the wealth of the richest accrue at a much faster rate. So what do we need to do? On the one hand, this is what we call the low road. And this is, if we continue down a low road, the policies that some countries are pursuing will see increasing inequality. But we also want to show that some countries are breaking free from this and pursuing other paths that could take us on a high road to reducing inequality. So on the low road side, we know that more than 50% of workers are in vulnerable or precarious work, and 40% are trapped in an informal sector where there are no minimum wages and no rights. But on the other hand, we've seen in Brazil, the minimum wage rose by nearly 50% in real terms between 1995 and 2011, which contributed to a decline in poverty and inequality. So some countries are making choices that are helping to reduce inequality. So that's the example as it pertains to work and wages. The next policy area that we need to see countries pursuing is relating to taxing and spending. And I think we know, and especially in a country like Finland, you know that the tax system is one of the most important tools that a government has at its disposal to address inequality. Of course, taxes are essential sources of revenue, they fund public services, and they also create a relationship or a contract between citizens and the state. But we also know that badly designed tax systems can exacerbate and reinforce inequality. So while the most prosperous enjoy low rates, exemptions, can take advantage of tax loopholes, and the richest can hide their money in overseas tax havens, that leaves huge holes in national budgets that the rest of us have to fill or else see cuts to public services. So I think failures in the international tax system as well as regressive national tax systems affect all of us. An example of the low road that's leading us to greater inequality is in Sierra Leone. The tax incentives for just 6 companies amounted to 59% of the entire budget of the country. And this is an increasing problem where there's a race to the bottom on tax, countries competing with each other to attract investment and business, leading to all of us losing out. On the other hand, taking the high road, there are countries like Senegal and Uruguay who are reforming their tax systems, reducing taxes for the poorest and increasing for the richest, which is leading to them raising more revenues for public services. So there is another way rather than the race to the bottom on tax. The next policy area is on health and education, and these are very strong weapons in the fight against inequality. So what we see is public services can act as equalizers. We call it virtual income. So it's a way that the poorest people can have accesses to goods and services that improve their lives. They have the power to transform societies, enabling people to claim their rights and hold governments to account. So what we've seen is on the low road side here, you may be aware, a growing enthusiasm for so-called low-fee private schools in developing countries. And even in spite of the term low fee, these schools are prohibitively expensive for the poorest families, and they're widening the gap between rich and poor. While governments and donors focus more on investing in low-fee private schools, the state system, the free public education system, suffers further. On the other hand, on the high road, we have seen many, even very poor countries, introduce free healthcare for at least some or all of their citizens. And the final policy area I want to highlight today is that we're calling it freedom from fear, but this is really about social protection or a safety net that really protects the very poorest. And again, like healthcare and education, social protection puts virtual income into the pockets of those who need it most, and it's a real central part of reducing economic inequality. So on the low road, on the downside, recent figures show that more than 70% of the world's population is not adequately covered by social protection. But on the other hand, on the high road, we have seen in a number of countries universal social protection reaping benefits. And one study found that social protection was responsible for a quarter of the reduction in inequality in Brazil. So it's got a really important role to play in the fight against inequality. My final slide, I wanted to end on this note, which is talking about people power, taking on the 1%. And really, this cuts across the whole issue of tackling inequality. And this is to remind us that throughout history, it's shown time and time again that the real antidote to the power of elites is the mobilization of an informed and empowered active citizenry. So this idea of people power is an absolutely crucial ingredient in the fight against inequality, and it's something that Oxfam's really focusing on in our global Even It Up campaign. And just this graphic here, I think, shows the scale of the problem, where the top 1% controls 46% of the world's wealth, and he's at the top saying still not enough. And Oxfam thinks it's time to put a stop to this, and it's time to even it up. So we really look forward to, hope you have a fruitful discussion today. If anyone has any questions for me in English before you turn back over to your discussions.
Aha, nyt mennään luonnon menetelmillä, jos ei. No niin, löytyyhän sieltä ääntä. Thank you, Alison. We have time for 2 questions. We have microphones here. So please raise your hand and introduce yourself and your organization, and Alison can take 2 questions. Well, I think
I answered it all. It's so clear.
Comprehensive and concise. Yeah. Oh, here we go.
Thank you. Thank you for the excellent presentation. My name is Terhi Ylikoski. I work with Kepa here in Helsinki. To me, the most groundbreaking thing about the discourse on poverty versus discourse on inequality is that when we talk about poverty, we can talk about them and the others. And then when we talk about inequality, we actually have to look at ourselves as well and the policies in our own countries. And this can also be quite controversial. So I would be interested to hear that how has your campaign been? How has it been perceived in the UK, and what are the responses that you have been getting?
Yeah, sure. I think it's a really good question, and it's one of the things that I think is so great about this Even It Up campaign from Oxfam's perspective is it does feel like a truly global campaign, and I think we're finding it resonates with people, as you say, in all countries. In terms of the UK, it's a really challenging issue to raise, and especially I know, like Finland, we are coming up to an election in the spring next year in the UK, which means it's an even more challenging question. So I don't have a simple answer for you. It's very politically challenging. It's very difficult. It's something that the UK public inherently understands. And as we've seen from some of the surveys and studies, people feel angry about inequality. I think there's a feeling which may be the same in Finland. People feel powerless, and there's never been kind of more of a democratic crisis in terms of people feeling that they can create change through the democratic system. People feel that it's not working for them, so it can make it really difficult. It'll be interesting to see whether that leads to this being a highly political election, or whether people just feel so disengaged, and we're kind of having to understand that mood in terms of getting our messages out about inequality. But in terms of the UK public, there's no doubt that this is an issue that resonates for them, helping people understand the extent to which they should be concerned about inequality in their own lives, and also translate that into even further concern for people in the poorest countries, not sort of turn in amongst ourselves and only worry about our problems at home, but to link those. If inequality affects us here so much in a country in which we do, even though they're weakening over time, we have safety nets, we have public services. Imagine how much this problem is affecting those in countries who are already facing some of the largest problems, the poorest people. So I think I don't have a simple answer for you. We are going up to an election. It's very political, and it'll be interesting. I hope that people will feel that they can mobilize and become angry together rather than completely disengage from the political process.
Thank you. Anybody else? No? Well, we'll be hearing more about our election campaign here today. Do you have any hints? How would we mobilize the Finns into this debate?
Oh, God. I've never been to Finland. Is that so? I'll come back again and again to learn about the Finnish people. But you have many candidates. This is very interesting for us. So in England, we've got kind of two, and so your sounds like you have a much more interesting and I'd say interesting election campaign ahead of you, where you can probably look for allies and different relationships and different points of view coming from many candidates. Whereas for us, we're a bit stuck with. Just two. So it sounds interesting, and good luck, and I hope that inequality is able to be a real mobilizing issue for you and for your election campaign.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Alison.